All right, good day everyone, and welcome to this Fintelekt webinar at which I'm joined by Lia van Broekhoven and Sangeeta Goswami of the Human Security Collective based in The Hague in the Netherlands. And this is an organization that works at the intersection of development, security, and civic engagement, advocating for inclusive and risk-sensitive approaches to AML-CFT. So I had an opportunity to meet with Lia and Sangeeta a couple of months ago at the FATF Private Sector Collaboration Forum. And immediately after meeting them, I felt that it would be very interesting uh, for the Fintelekt community to gain some different perspectives from them, as their views will possibly be very different as compared to what we are normally accustomed to hearing. So, Lia and Sangeeta, at the outset, thank you so much for joining me today and for making the time to share your thoughts with the Fintelekt community. So the
Thank
format
you,
for today's
Shirish.
webinar is going to be very casual and conversational. I will essentially pose a few questions to both my guests and participants. If you would like to ask them any questions too, please feel free to post them in the Q&A window, and I will take them up towards the end. But before we start, let me do a quick round of formal introductions. So Lia is the executive director at the Human Security Collective, a role that she has held for the past 12 years. She leads efforts to engage civil society organizations worldwide with the UN, EU, FATF, OSCE, and national governments on a human security approach to prevent violent extremism. Under her leadership, HSC also works closely with a core group of civil society organizations to engage with the FATF on preventive terrorism financing while upholding civil society freedom. Sangeeta is the Director of Policy and Advocacy, and she leads HSC's work with the Global Nonprofit Coalition on FATF, which is a network of nearly 450 NPOs worldwide advocating for risk-based implementation of financial integrity standards that avoid unintended consequences like NPO suppression and bank de-risking. So her work focuses on ensuring that regulation and oversight of the NPO sector remain proportional and do not disrupt legitimate activities. So, Lia and Sangeeta, again, thank you so much for being here. To start off the Q&A, let's start the discussion with the FATF framework, which, as we know, is designed as a universal set of recommendations, but its implementation over the years suggests that a one-size-fits-all approach is not suitable for different contexts. So, in this respect, what are some of the challenges that you both see on the ground during your day-to-day work?
Shall I kick off? Thank you. Thank you,
Please.
Shirish, for this kind introduction. And it's a true pleasure to be here with you and the Fintelekt community. So thanks for having us both. This is a really good kickoff question. From our perspective, we have seen that one-size-fits-all approach, which we still see being implemented in too many countries across the globe, resulted in a number of unintended and intended consequences for sectors, but also for the NPO sector. Because this approach is not risk-based, and therefore the AML-CFT laws and regulations and rules are not proportionate and focused. Let me clarify a bit more. First, there is de-risking of NPOs. So non-profits are excluded from the regulated financial sector and resort to other ways of transferring money, which might lead to financial integrity risks. Financial institutions like banks and payment service providers calculate risk based on a number of parameters, of which the FATF AML-CFT rules are paramount. That is what we have experienced for the NPO sector. In quite a few countries, banks will use the national AML-CFT risk assessment as a source for their own risk assessment of customers, including non-profits. When the national risk assessment concludes that NPOs are high risk, banks often automatically perform an enhanced due diligence on civil society organizations and non-profits. Thus, the quality of the national risk assessment when it comes to determining whether or not or to what extent NPOs can be used for terrorism financing is crucial. We have witnessed that classifying the entire NPO sector as high risk for some of these NRAs is not based on empirical evidence, but on assumptions, often baseless assumptions, such as the entire sector is at risk for terrorism financing. Sangeeta, would you like to add a few things?
Yeah, no, you've been quite comprehensive, Leah, but just a couple of things. As you said, Shirish, I mean, it is a set of universal benchmarks, the FATF framework and standards that sort of apply to vastly different contexts. And I think, the measure of effectiveness still remains predicated on a very sort of tick box exercise. So even though, it is, a risk-based approach that they promulgate, you still have to, the technical compliance standards, the 40 technical compliance standards are still very much sort of tick box. So, I think if we got rid of those 40 standards and were just left with the 10 immediate outcomes on effectiveness, for example, I think you would go towards a truly risk-based approach, whereas now countries still have to sort of tick those requirements in the 40 boxes, which make it then more rule-based instead of risk-based. So that I think is an anomaly at the heart of it. And I think a couple more things very quickly, adding to what Leah said. I think, the FATF standards were designed by and for the larger economies. It initially started, as, your community probably knows, to sort of counter money laundering. And that was sort of, and it is the larger countries that are at the policy making table as well. So it is sort of designed for and around, the larger economies. So then to sort of implement them in the smaller economies or the medium-sized economies, there is that there do arise dichotomies there. And then, another thing that, increasingly we are seeing, and NPOs, I think, fall prey to this, is that it is, predicated on a perfect democratic system, so that, you have, checks and balances, you have oversight mechanisms, etc. But when you have sort of hybrid, autocratic systems, all of that goes awry, and then that's when you get cases of NPO suppression, etc. So so that, the framework is predicated on certain things, and we don't live in a perfect world, and that's when you see some of these consequences, whether intended or unintended, arising.
Right. Thanks. Thanks both for that. So coming back to Lia. So Lia, despite the FATF's emphasis on the risk-based approach, right? So banks, FIs, regulators, they often feel compelled that they have to meet all the technical compliance requirements, even in low-risk situations, right? Now, quite likely leading to a situation of what we can call as over-compliance. Now, this, I believe, is especially affecting NPOs in the context of Recommendation 8. So how can we ensure that risk assessments genuinely drive policy rather than becoming a box-ticking approach dictated by FATF evaluations?
Again, very good questions. How do we do that? Well, in our community of NPOs, we have seen that when NPOs are engaged in the national risk assessment, the quality goes up in terms of empirical evidence about the risk that NPOs have for terrorism financing abuse. So it's important that NPOs engage. First, they have to know why a country does a risk assessment, also on their sector. Often we see, that the NPO sector has no clue, and all of a sudden they appear in the national risk assessment as high risk for terrorism financing. So that is, we have seen that in so many countries across the globe. So our Global NPO Coalition decided that we need to engage at country level with the government to improve this, let's say, practice of ignoring the NPO sector as an important stakeholder in contributing to a national risk assessment. And we have seen that when this happens, the quality goes up because NPOs have an awful lot of knowledge about, money laundering and terrorism financing, fraud, corruption risk they run. And many of them have also very good risk management tools in place. In quite a few countries, there's also independent regulators that come up with NPO standards to which the membership have to adhere to, and they're audited for these standards, right? On transparency, good governance, and so on and so forth. So the quality of the risk assessment goes up when NPOs are engaged. So that's one thing we would like to share with your audience. We have also another, I think, example where we've seen that when an NPO cannot engage because the government feels it is not the right time or they feel mistrust, when the NPO sector itself can conduct a shadow risk assessment, often with the support of experts on the AML CFT standards of the FATF, this also creates an opportunity for NPOs to provide the results of the sectoral shadow risk assessment to the government. And interestingly, in one of the key FATF member states, Germany, an NPO risk assessment conducted by the sector itself made its way into the official national risk assessment, as it was considered by the government as a credible assessment of NPO risk for terrorism financing. And the findings of the shadow risk assessment made its way into the official mutual evaluation report. So if a national or sectoral risk assessment of the NPO sector is of good quality, then the supervisor, the regulator of financial institutions, can also apply the findings of this risk assessment in its own procedures to supervise the banking sector. This is really key. It's key because this would give the banking sector comfort that in the guidance of a supervisor, it's already stated that certain sectors, like the NPO sector, deriving from a good quality risk assessment, is low to medium risk. And then this gives them comfort in their own due diligence on the NPO sector to apply simplified due diligence measures. And this is key, and I also key because, as you know, the FATF at the moment is revising recommendation 1. And part of this revision is that they want to come up with, they want to produce a financial inclusion guidelines. And the notion of simplified oversight, right, both by the public and private sectors on sectors that are low to medium risk for terrorism financing, will be, I think, a big step forward to get it right in the implementation of the AML CFT standards.
Right. Thank you so much for that, Lia. So, Sangeeta, I had a question for you. I recently came across some information. I think it was a LinkedIn post, on your work in Gambia and the importance of multi-stakeholder engagement in AML safety policy making. So, can you give us a summary of your experiences there? What best practices would you recommend for banks, FIs, and regulators to adopt to ensure that the affected sectors are actually meaningfully included in shaping AML safety frameworks going forward?
Yeah, thanks, Shirish. Another good question. This whole, if I can just rewind a little bit, this whole recommendation 8 is actually a bit of an outlier in this whole FATF framework, so to speak. So you have, financial institutions, law enforcement, international cooperation mechanisms, etc. And suddenly you have this recommendation 8 on non-profit organizations, the only legal entity that actually has a recommendation to itself, and that is, it goes back to 9/11 and when these recommendations were written, and the context at that time, and potential sort of abuse of, charities to finance that attack, of which there was, a little bit of evidence at that point. But, the fact that, that led to an entire recommendation, as somebody said later on, if you start framing recommendations on every risk or every threat, then you won't have 40 recommendations. You'll have, hundreds of recommendations. But we are where we are, and it is what it is. And governments really struggle with recommendation 8, because you have, who are the people who are sort of in charge of a mutual evaluation? It's ministries of finance, it's central banks, it's FIUs, etc. And suddenly there is this, they have to get data on the non-profit sector. They have to understand how the non-profit sector works. They have to look at non-profit oversight, and it's a different beast, and so, which is why we get some of the the suppression, the overregulation, and some of the other consequences. So, as you were saying, multi-stakeholder dialogue is essential for this, because often when you talk to nonprofit organizations and you mention terrorism financing, they just look at you a bit quizzically and say, yeah, but what have we got to do with this? We work on humanitarian aid, or we work on development, or peace building, or human rights. I mean, we have nothing to do with terrorism financing. So, there is awareness, you need to raise awareness, for the nonprofit sector, but you also need to raise awareness for governments and, other banks, financial institutions, regulators, central banks, on each other's mandates, and everybody comes at this from a particular lens. So I think sitting down together and understanding where everybody comes from, and that at the end of the day everybody wants the same thing. Nobody wants the NPS sector to be abused for terrorism financing, least of all the nonprofit sector, who is trying to do its work in all these various fields. And so, yeah, we do, as a global NPO coalition, we do a lot of work in country with different stakeholders. Nonprofits, of course, being one of them. But the post you referred to, we were doing some work in Gambia, which, as the government told us, is at low risk for terrorism financing, but they were jumping through hoops trying to comply with, to get their technical compliance on Recommendation 8 in order. And, there are so many challenges. The data on NPOs doesn't sit in one place. There is oversight on NPOs in general by the tax authority, or somebody else, the registration authority. But then what the FATF has brought in post 2011 is a requirement to oversee the sector for terrorism financing, right? So that is an additional layer of oversight. And often your terrorism financing oversight sits with security bodies. So often, the FIU is tasked with that, but the FIU has little understanding of the sector, and how does all that sort of meld together? What are the regulatory frameworks? So, this is something we talk about when we go in country in terms of, regulatory and oversight frameworks. And the FATF has recently revised Recommendation 8, saying that NPOs should not be obliged entities or reporting entities. So theoretically, the FIU really shouldn't, the NPO oversight shouldn't really sit under an FIU. But in law, in many countries, it sits under the FIU. So then you need changes in legislation, and everybody's sort of jumping around in hoops trying to do that. And it's, sometimes it's easier in high capacity countries, but in countries which are already struggling for resources, which have other priorities, national priorities, which is, countries are often, some countries are low risk for terrorism financing, then this becomes an additional burden to tick all the boxes, really, which they have to do, which is why I say, the FATF framework is still very much rule-based, and, potentially needs to being more risk-based. So if a country in its national risk assessment says, yeah, we are at low risk for terrorism financing, and the NPO sector is also low risk, then maybe they can, do a light touch Recommendation 8 and not, go through 8.1, 8.2, 8.3, and all the rest of it that they need to do to comply. So yeah, these are conversations we're still having with the FATF, and I think it'll take a while. I mean, it's been 20 years since we've had it, 24 odd years. I think, policy change is always slow, but as a global NPO coalition, I think what we do with our work in country is, to provide, this empirical evidence from the ground on what is working, what is not working, in the hope that some of this policy is changed to make it more effective in the long run.
Right, thanks. So continuing, on that topic, so countries that have a low terrorism financing risk sometimes still face the threat of grey listing because they have some regulatory shortcomings, right? So how does this affect banks or financial institutions or NPOs actually in practice? And what steps do you suggest can be taken to ensure that these grey listing decisions truly reflect risk rather than just the regulatory compliance gaps?
Yeah, no, another very good question. Again, yeah, I think, this whole gray listing is also very problematic. And I think, the current FATF president has tried to address some of that. I think they've, increased the observation period to 2 years from 1 year. So they've doubled that, before a country enters the ICRG process. There is now a threshold below, if a country is, below a certain GDP, I think they won't get on the grey list. So there have been some changes made to the grey listing process, which hopefully will help. But if you look at the current grey listing map, most of the countries are in sub-Saharan Africa, and that should tell you something, right? Because, in terms of where the dirty money is flowing through, where most of the money laundering happens. I mean, everyone knows, it's no secret that it's, London and Amsterdam and, the other big capitals, that dirty money flows through, parts of the US, etc. So, but those big countries who are FATF members know how to game the system and never get on the grey list, whereas many countries in sub-Saharan Africa and others, obviously they have some regulatory gaps, or according to this universalist system, which is not context driven or context based, as much context driven as it should be. But again, these are the countries that end up on the grey list, and I think perhaps the new grey listing criteria will help. But the other thing we see is that when countries get on a grey list, immediately because it affects trade, it affects aid, and importantly for these sub-Saharan countries, it impacts capital inflow and development aid. Because banks don't want to transact, or banks want to do enhanced due diligence on every transaction that goes through. So, because of the grave impact, countries are desperate to get out of the grey list, and, they just want to tick all the boxes as quickly as possible. And on recommendation aid, that's where we see the greatest harm. They'll quickly pass an NGO bill, for example, which has, far-reaching consequences for the sector, which is overly burdensome, which is not risk-based or proportionate or focused. So those are the effects we see. So, one of our coalition members called it sort of grey listing induced panic, GLIP. He coined this phrase, and that's what we see in many of the countries, that the harm to the non-profit sector is done, a lot of the times when a country gets on the grey list, and they pass laws, rules, regulations, in an effort to get out, or in an effort to comply with the technical compliance recommendations of the FATF, and in doing so, sort of over-regulate and pass burdensome regulation on the sector. So that's sort of some of the harms that we see from the grey listing process.
Right.
Lia, I don't know whether you wanted to add anything.
No, nothing to add. Just, it's evident what you're saying, Sangeeta, that in resource poor countries, right, the whole FATF, let's say, evaluation cycle creates, I would say, a lot of panic, including regulatory panic or potential grey listing inducing panic. And that leads to badly developed and designed and also, politically driven laws and regulations, which play out negatively, we've seen, for civil society and NPOs in certain countries. So yeah, that's what I would like to add. And as you said, the FATF has taken this internally, seriously to a certain extent. But we've also experienced that the FATF, and probably your community as well, or you are having to live with the AML-CFT rules as compliance officers. It is a beast, right? And how to, I say, improve the train this beast has set in motion is very, very difficult. So and I just want to add what Sangeeta already said. Resource poor countries are suffering more than those that have the resources, although also in resource rich countries, we've seen that the FATF takes away a lot of human resources from governments that are in charge, that are leading or are responsible for the implementation of the AML-CFT standards in that country. Yeah.
Right. Well said, Lia. So, in fact, continuing on the resource poor country theme, in such countries, we know that implementing FATF requirements can actually divert attention and can, you also mentioned people, right? And we can also divert funds away from critical sectors. So whether it's education or healthcare, for example. So, how can policymakers, banks, civil society find a more balanced approach that ensures financial integrity without disproportionately burdening essential services? So, Sangeeta, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think the risk-based approach is really key to this, because if you don't have firstly, as Leah was saying earlier, if you don't have a robust risk assessment, the market, financial institutions um, don't get the proper guidance on, how they should assess certain entities, including legal entities like non-profit organizations. And then, they will be doing enhanced due diligence on the whole sector, which takes away, resources, and which, makes the system inefficient, so to speak. But there's also this whole point on how do you conceptualize risk, right? Which is it's a larger point, I think, because I think, there needs to be an understanding, for example, talking specifically of the nonprofit sector, that the work that nonprofits do, whether that's humanitarian, peace building, development, or, rights and due process work, actually goes towards addressing the root causes of terrorism and other criminal behavior. And so what happens when financial integrity and regulatory frameworks sort of get in the way of that? So it's, when talking about risk, I think it's important to have a more holistic understanding of risk. And I think governments in turn, I think, and this is a big ask really, need to understand that you can't really regulate your way out of risk. I think governments increasingly, what we see is they don't want to address the root causes of why there is terrorism, or why there is crime, or why there is fraud, and instead sort of like this approach of, putting in regulation to address it. And the moment you start putting in regulation, that is resource intensive for everybody, right? And whereas if you address the root causes, you work towards decreasing some of these, criminal behaviors, and, related, whether it's terrorism or money laundering or fraud, or etc. So yeah, so I think we have had 25 odd years of this huge, financial crime compliance, industrial complex, and it's just, layering and layering upon regulation, without government sort of, actually putting money towards addressing the root causes, or trying to understand the root causes. And I think till we do that, we will just be expending resources on, not the cause, but, an outcome really. So yeah, so
Fantastic.
Leah, I don't know whether you wanted to add anything.
No, I think that's great. But of course, addressing root causes of financial crime is a very, very complex, complicated issue. And it requires political will. And what you were saying, Sharice, in resource-poor countries, but also countries' resources, what type of government do you have? What does your population want, right? If education, access to education, access to healthcare, the building of critical infrastructure, I think will enter in the top three, and then financial crime, addressing that will not enter in the top three. So this is also a question of political will in a country, and that's very difficult to address for a technical body like the FATF. I would like to add this. And, also a difficult issue for us to address as civil society, for our colleagues, because you enter actually into the discussion, what is important for the socio-economic and political development of a country? And is financial crime something we as a country, but all relevant stakeholders need to address? And where does it end in our list of priorities in terms of the development of a country? So, yeah.
Right, right. All right. So I still have one more question for you, but let me just announce to the participants that if they have any questions for you, this would be the time to post it in the Q&A window, so that after my final question for Leah and Sangeeta is over, I can take any of the audience questions. So Leah, FATF has acknowledged that financial exclusion is a problem, right? And but still, NPOs in many countries continue to struggle with access to financial services because banks are doing de-risking. So, what policy interventions or institutional measures do you think could help ensure that banks can meet the AML/CFT obligations, but yet not unnecessarily, cut off legitimate NPO activities? And we have a lot of banks in the audience today, so I think this will be very helpful to them.
Thank you for the question, Shirish. Well, I think lessons can be learned from, I would say, a mechanism which is the stakeholder dialogue or the round table, where stakeholders that have an interest in improving the implementation of AML/CFT standards in the country come together and address, from our point of view, of course, the financial access challenges of NPOs and ways to solve them collectively. So it's the NPOs, it's the private sector, banks, payment service providers, but also neobanks and the ones that are regulating the banking sector and supervising them and legislating them. So Ministry of Finance, central banks, financial intelligence units, and so on. And let me give you an example from some of these multi-stakeholder dialogues in which we as Human Security participated. And I would like to focus on one in specific, which is the multi-stakeholder dialogue in my own country, and where Sangeeta also works, the Netherlands, where Human Security Collective co-hosts a roundtable since 2018 in an official, let's say, format, together with our Ministry of Finance and in partnership with our Ministry of Justice and Security, our Ministry of Foreign Affairs, that is the biggest net donor of development cooperation, civil society in my country, and the Dutch Banking Association. Now, this roundtable had the purpose of identifying ways for all the stakeholders to prevent further de-risking of the non-profit sector in the Netherlands, which happened quite a lot in the past 10 years or so. So one of the successes of this roundtable was a specific topic we addressed in the roundtable, led by our Dutch Banking Association, with the endorsement of the banking supervisor, the Dutch Central Bank, and the co-legislator, the Ministry of Finance, to arrive to an NPO sector risk-based standard. And we have that standard now. The standard was thus developed by the banks, the Dutch Banking Association, and the Dutch NPO independent regulator. So we came to the table, the project lasted 1 year, and this standard is actually premised on the collective agreement that NPOs, when being onboarded or when transferring money to so-called high-risk areas, so blacklisted countries on the FATF list or gray-listed countries, are neutral risk for the bank. They should be neutral risk. We developed together parameters for increasing the risk or lowering the risk. So a risk lowering parameter is when NPOs have a recognition from the independent NPO regulator in the Netherlands. That is a risk lowering. Or when they have a tax break status from the Dutch tax authorities that also audit NPOs on a number of indicators whether they are worthy of this tax breaks. So this, let's say, badge of honors via the tax authorities or via the independent regulator are risk lowering. Risk increasing indicator is, for example, if the board of an NPO comprises only of family members. That is a red flag, right? This is not something the banks have invented or the regulator, but we also as NPOs say this might be a red flag. So we can, Sangeeta has already shared that, risk-based standard, NPO risk-based standard in the box. So that risk-based standard was produced in 2023. At the moment, we are now monitoring the uptake of the standard, and we have 2 data points for that. The NPO sector, under our guidance, is issuing a survey yearly to about 1,000 NPOs to feedback whether onboarding or transferring to high-risk areas have improved. So that is a proxy for us whether the standard has been taken up by the banks. Then the Banking Association sends questionnaires to all the banks that have to take up the standards with a number of questions, what they've done internally to integrate the standard in their procedures and protocols, their KYCDD procedures and protocols. Now, interestingly, last year we have seen that one of the international banks have exactly done that. They have incorporated the standards in their KYC-DD procedures, which led to a decrease of 21,000 high-risk NPOs to 1,200, which is an amazing improvement for cost efficiency of the banks. So that is success. And we see that other banks are now following suit. So that is, I would say, a success story. But there is, of course, another important element, I would say, that is also that the Dutch supervisor of the banks need to integrate this success in their own, let's say, supervisory models to the banks. And that is what they're going to do. They're going to carry out themselves a second study on whether the AML-CFT laws and regulations in the Netherlands have been complied with by the banking sector in a risk-based, proportionate, and focused way. They've done that 4 years ago, and it turned out that on certain sectors, the NPO sectors, the banks have gone overboard, yet, de-risking. But this second study, the Dutch central banks will also take it upon themselves. Do we need to change our supervisory model, right? So I think that's a big step forward. So they want to go to a simplified supervision model on the banks for certain sectors, including the NPO sector. And they will use the data points which I provided coming from the NPO sector on the uptake of the NPO risk-based standard and the questionnaires sent out by the Dutch banking associations on their own banks with data on whether this NPO standards has been taken up. So what you can see, Shirish, is one example. I hope it is understandable for your audience, but we can send some information later on because it's a bit of a package, more than only their NPO standard itself. But this requires a group of institutions that stays the course. So you need a credible, leader from the NPO sector. You need the Dutch Banking Association, and you need a very good communication pathway with both the supervisor and the co-legislator, the Ministry of Finance. But we have seen that this is possible also in countries outside of Europe. For example, Nigeria has started a similar process with one of the partners of our global NPO coalition, Spaces for Change. And they have, we have given them some advice on how we, were helping out with the similar process in the Netherlands and our roundtable. And they've taken some, I would say, helpful elements for their own roundtable in Nigeria. And we see they've come quite a long way. And one of the successes, for example, was in Nigeria that through this roundtable mechanism there, the nonprofits are not any longer considered by law a designated non-profession or business under the FATF regulations. So, it's possible also for countries where I would say they are more complicated in terms of the relationship between different relevant stakeholders to get this right. Thank you.
Right, fantastic. Thank you so much for that answer. In fact, let me point out to the audience that Sangeeta has posted 2 documents in the chat box. And of course, we will also possibly share that with everyone later. One is the Dutch NPO sector standard, and the other is the Dutch Banking Association risk standards. There are 2 documents posted there if you'd like to download them. And we also have one question, Lia and Sangeeta, from a member of the audience, which I think you have possibly partly answered already, but I'll read it out anyway. Chin says, I agree that we need a strong political will to fight financial crime. May I have your view on what is the best approach for collaboration amongst countries to fight financial crime and money laundering in Southeast Asia? So would you like to address, either of you like to address that question?
That is quite a question. Well, perhaps let me kick off, and then Sangeeta, please add. Would that be okay? I think you know, and I really have to commend you, Shirish, on bringing us into your community. I think this sort of webinars are helpful, but we also have, let's say, we have a coalition of nonprofits in South and Southeast Asia, which is led by a partner of ours that is active in this part of the world, and where we, at least, you know, from our end, what we can do is to make them aware of the importance of engagement on financial crime issues, right? From a civil society and NPO sector. And that's not easy. As Sangeeta was saying, for many civil society nonprofits, you know, why do we have to be engaged on this issue? And our argument is always, if you're not engaging on at least the policy that comes out from your government on financial crime, whether it's AML, CFT, whether it's anti-fraud, anti-corruption, it will really harm you at some point. So be there at the table. And what is interesting is that some of these NPOs do have a lot of knowledge, right? On human trafficking, on wildlife trafficking, on child abuse, on scamming, for example. So they need to be engaged more. They need to be engaged more with the policymakers, but also with people in the operational field like yourself. And I think some of the webinars we organize are a kickoff point for that. On the political end, you know, how to trigger your political masters to take this as a priority issue, I'd rather leave that up to, you know, from my point of view, to NPOs in the country itself. But I can tell you, in my own country, some of our NGOs are very active in lobbying parliamentarians that are knowledgeable on financial crime issues to address, as Sangeeta said, root causes, and not start with regulatory overdrive, which we now see in many countries in the European Union, where layer upon layer of regulation is not going to take away the root causes of financial crime. Then we enter a debate on, you know, you need to work at grassroots level with communities, with youngsters, right, that are so easily pulled in the financial crime arena. And that requires, well, another set of discussions, but not impossible.
Fantastic. All right. So we don't have any more questions from the audience, but what we'll do is, you know, Lia and Sangeeta, if you'd like us to share any material with the participants, those who had registered and attended, we'll be happy to do that sometime in the coming week. But in the meantime, thank you so much to both of you for spending your time and effort and preparing for this session, and for sharing your thoughts with the Fintelekt community. Much appreciated, and you know, thank you again.
Thank you, Shirish. It was a
Thank
pleasure.
you so much. It was a great pleasure. Thanks so much.
All right.
Goodbye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye then. Have a good day.
You too. Bye-bye.